Car, is this your camera? Okay. You, I didn't see you.
Good evening. I am Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and before I introduce our forum speaker this evening, I'd like to take this occasion to make a very special announcement in honor of Her Majesty's presence on the campus of Harvard University, which is the creation of a new endowed fellowship for Jordanian students at the Kennedy School. Mr. Ali Assad, a member of the Kennedy School's Dean Council, has generously established this new fellowship in honor of his late father, Farid Assad. Farid Assad and the fellowship in his name honors the life and legacy of one of Jordan's most distinguished citizens. His career included excellence in public service, international trade and commerce, finance, education, science and technology, and especially generous philanthropic support of education in Jordan and Lebanon. The Assad Fellowship continues its legacy, providing opportunities for outstanding students to attend the Kennedy School's degree programs. Ali has pledged to build the endowment for this fellowship over time so it will endow a new junior faculty member in international finance in his father's name. Please join me in recognizing Ali Assad and thanking him for his generous commitment in honor of Her Majesty's visit to Harvard. Ali, would you please stand? On behalf of the Kennedy School, the Institute of Politics, the Institute for Social and Economic Policy in the Middle East, and the Harvard Radcliffe Society of Arab Students, It's a pleasure to welcome you tonight, and particularly to welcome tonight's speaker. Her Majesty Queen Noor of Jordan was born of a very distinguished Arab-American family, and when she went for her high school years, she did them in Concord, Massachusetts, not very far from here. And then she went to Princeton University. She received her degree in architecture and urban planning in 1974. She told me that she was in the first class of women in Princeton. So she helped to break, fortunately, a tradition which needed breaking. And she was then involved in various international urban and design projects throughout the world, but one of them took her to Jordan, where she became the director of planning and design projects for Royal Jordanian Airlines. In 1978, she married King Hussein, and for the past 18 years, she's initiated, directed, and sponsored projects which promote international understanding and address the needs of the Jordanian people. Her projects include a number, such as the Royal Endowment for Culture and Education, which provides scholarships to students, especially outstanding women, to pursue graduate studies, the Jubilee School, which seeks to enroll talented students, particularly those from less developed parts of Jordan, and the National Task Force on Children, which ensures the welfare of children and assures that it remains a top priority in Jordan's national development plans. In 1985, the Noor al-Hussein Foundation was established to initiate and support numerous other projects in education, child welfare, women and community development, cultural preservation, and environmental protection. Several of these projects have been recognized by the United Nations as model projects for the Middle East and the developing world. Queen Noor has also lectured extensively on politics in the Middle East at various conferences and organizations and universities, and it's in that capacity that she joins us here tonight to speak about the challenges of peace from her unique perspective. Please join me in welcoming Her Majesty Queen Noor.
Thank you, Dean Nye. Faculty and students, distinguished guests, I'd like to begin by thanking the Harvard Radcliffe Society of Arab Students, the Institutes of Politics and of Social and Economic Policy in the Middle East at Harvard's JFK Kennedy School of Government for the invitation to be with you today, particularly the students chairing the Harvard Radcliffe Society of Arab Students who initially contacted me and whom I'm very proud to say are two very fine Jordanians, of whom we're very proud. It's a privilege to be with you here this evening. President Rudenstein, I'd understand, had planned to be here tonight, which I had looked forward to since I feel something of a connection. He was for many years provost at my alma mater, Princeton, and both of us since have moved on to alternative lifestyles. I know how important the president of Harvard is. I remember hearing how once, when FDR, I think it was visiting here, his staff needed to reach him for some crisis, a situation I'm familiar with. They called the university office and asked to speak to the president. "I'm sorry, you can't," the secretary replied. "The president is in a meeting with Mr. Roosevelt." So when I think of President Rudenstein, I can't help feeling some hope in spite of the precarious situation in our region. If a Princeton provost can become president of Harvard, then anything can happen. Still, we do face some serious challenges. There are times when I think that solving the territorial disputes in the Middle East is almost as challenging as fighting for a parking space in Harvard Square, which I hope wasn't too much of a problem for all of you tonight. I spoke just over a decade in this same hall on the same subject, the vital need for peace in the Middle East. It is striking to think of how much has changed and how much has not. I remember debating whether or not to take questions after my lecture, always a concern for me in those early years, as my speaking tours usually coincided and planned well in advance. They always seemed to coincide with the sudden emergence of a new Middle East crisis. Obviously, this is one of the things that has not changed. I read later that my indecision had been interpreted as waiting for permission to speak from Amman, which no doubt reflected ironic and well-worn stereotypes which have haunted me most of my married life about women and Arab society, politics, and royalty. Of course, my role as an outspoken wife of a head of state was quite unusual at that time, thanks to the extraordinary confidence in me shown by my husband and the multitude of international organizations and institutions who, in spite of the media stereotypes, urged me to play an active role as a bridge of cross-cultural and political understanding. Those persistent stereotypes and misconceptions about the Middle East had also struck me when, as a Princeton architecture and urban planning graduate, I first went to live and work there in the Middle East in 1975, prompted by my desire to explore my Arab roots and heritage. I evolved quickly from a problem-solving planner of man's habitat into an aspiring journalist, desperately concerned about problems with accuracy in reporting on the political and cultural environment of the Arab world. I felt a strong responsibility, almost a moral obligation, to try to correct grossly distorted Western stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims, and especially women. For I could see clearly how media stereotyping could set the emotional and political stage for policies that resulted in chronic misunderstanding and conflict. The mid-70s appeared to be a moment of hope for many people in the Middle East. Oil-fueled economic expansion was triggering an economic boom, which seemed to herald new prosperity for the region. Efforts for Arab-Israeli peace talks were attracting unprecedented global attention, and most people thought that the 1973 war would be the last major Arab-Israeli military clash. It was a time of rapid change, however, not all of that change was progress. Americans and Westerners in general saw the region as an important new business market of mega contracts and enormous consumer potential. From within the region, one could see the distorting impact of large money flows that could not be absorbed by once modest economies. My urban planning work in Iran in the mid-1970s exposed me to a sense of growing unrest in the Middle East. I felt the despair of ordinary people marginalized and threatened by growing gaps between rich and poor. The combination of political frustration, social alienation, and economic disparity created a volatile landscape, which the West largely overlooked because of its single-minded focus on ensuring access to oil. Moreover, the potential instability was exacerbated by trends towards a Western style and pace of development in some countries. One response to these pressures was the Islamic extremism that proliferated in Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and other countries. Western countries tend to view this rise only as a political threat to be confronted and contained. This approach ignores the different factors that fuel Islamism in our region. Above all, the seeming Western oblivious to Arab calls for implementation of international law and UN Security Council resolutions on the Middle East, as well as fears of foreign cultural and economic dominance and popular frustration with non-participatory political systems. One of the Middle East's more regrettable distinctions is that it has the largest number of refugees, and including Israel, the highest ratio of military spending to gross national product of any region in the world. Every day of my life in Jordan and throughout the Middle East, I could see the ravages of decades of warfare in unmet human needs, in fear, hate, and uncertainty as people's daily companions, in the constantly growing new belts of urban poverty, in the politics of extremism sweeping the region, and most importantly, in the plight of the Palestinian refugees in their increasingly permanent camps. Western public opinion was unaware of the human face of this tragedy. Most of the journalists that I knew who were covering the region in the mid-1970s during the time I worked there before my marriage routinely complained of the extreme bias of their editors back in the United States, who consistently distorted any objective balance of their reports by removing all but Israeli perspectives on Middle Eastern history, personalities, and events. The late 1970s and early 1980s would prove to be only another interlude of economic progress between the crises that had regularly staggered the region since the 1940s. For the Arab world, much of the decade was marked by a dizzying roller coaster of recurring hopes and dashed expectations. Every time the region began to generate real economic momentum, almost inevitably, the progress would be lost in the waste of war and the economic and emotional ravages of post-war despair. Almost every American president and leading political figure floated initiatives for Arab-Israeli peace settlements, all ultimately foundered. The Camp David agreements between Egypt and Israel were seen by Washington as a great success, but the Arab world received them with stupefied disbelief. They were denounced as a calculated fragmentation of Arab ranks, as a unilateral abandonment of the collective Arab commitment to peace, and as a failure to secure the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and the return of all occupied Arab territories. The worst of Arab fears were confirmed when the Camp David Accords were followed immediately by an intense outburst of new illegal Israeli settlements and the unilateral annexation of Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan Heights. Such Israeli actions in the wake of the Camp David Accords further diminished chances for a just and comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. It is impossible to ignore the depressing and ironic parallels to the situation today. Those underlying problems of the 1970s persisted into the mid-1980s when I spoke here on the importance of promoting peace in the Middle East as a whole. Peace in the Middle East as a first step toward broader reforms and progress in the Middle East as a whole. Today, another decade later, conditions in the Middle East and the quality of U.S.-Arab relations have improved in many ways, and yet both are still plagued by rising tensions and recurring conflicts that mirror the problems of decades past. Today's revived tensions in the Middle East are particularly troubling because people's expectations have been raised by the historic breakthroughs of recent years. The 1991 Madrid Middle East Peace Conference, the 1993 PLO Israeli Declaration of Principles, also called Oslo I, the 1994 Jordanian-Israeli Treaty of Peace, and the 1995 Palestinian-Israeli Interim Agreement on Expanded Palestinian Self-Rule in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Oslo II. All signaled hope for stability and regional cooperation. The United States directly, actively, and constructively promoted this peace, and in doing so, it earned the appreciation and respect of many Arab quarters. At the same time, many countries in our region have begun building on that hope and are opening up and liberalizing their economies and shifting towards more productive, sustainable growth and development. Tragically, we are still plagued by national confrontation among Arabs and Israelis in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, and still beset by the increasingly explosive issues of occupation of land, expansion of settlements, collective punishments, and violence. We are faced also with a growing inflexibility on crucial questions like water rights, refugees, frontiers, and especially the status of Jerusalem and Israeli redeployment from Hebron, which reflect the apparent tendency of the new administration in Israel to undermine agreements reached between the previous government and the Palestinian National Authority. Perhaps most dangerous of all, people throughout the Middle East are beginning to question whether those strides that have been made towards peace will in fact ever live up to their heightened expectations. It may have been tempting for many outside the region to conclude that peace had been achieved in the Middle East, and that only a few isolated problems of Arab and Israeli extremist violence remained to be tackled and resolved. But I would urge you today, much as I did here a decade ago, to look more deeply into the historical and political realities of the Middle East and the way they shape the attitudes and policies of our people. Until recently, we in Jordan had been firmly convinced that the historic peace process in the Middle East was irreversible. However, the lack of implementation of accords reached on the Palestinian-Israeli track, and to some extent on some of the bilateral agreements between Jordan and Israel, and the alarming deterioration of the situation in the Middle East have clearly highlighted the fragility of the progress so far achieved and shaken our belief that the peace process is irreversible. In order to build a comprehensive and enduring peace that will allow our region to join other stable and productive regions of the world, we all must recognize our common responsibility to end the ongoing vicious and destructive cycle of confrontation. The forces for peace in the Arab world and in Israel alike should be mobilized to exert a more powerful influence to face these challenges. Our first and most urgent challenge is to complete the Arab-Israeli peace process without delay and within a well-defined time frame. The Egyptian, Palestinian, and Jordanian peace accords with Israel are historic openings, but not yet much more than openings for Arabs and Israelis to interact and to consider the potential of their common future. 5 years after the Madrid conference, we are still talking about revitalizing the process itself. It is increasingly clear that time is a crucial element and that further delays will only benefit the enemies of peace. The quality of peace and the attainment of its full promise depend entirely on the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict in all its dimensions and among all concerned parties, as stipulated in the letter of invitation to the Madrid conference and its terms of reference, UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. Our second major challenge, directly linked to the success of the peace process, is to open borders and foster regional economic cooperation throughout the Middle East. Severe regional imbalances in resources such as population, energy, water, and arable land aggravate the conflicts that have made sustainable economic growth such an elusive goal. Integrating our human and natural resources would propel the entire Middle East toward long-term, sustainable socioeconomic development. And our third great challenge is to assume our place in the worldwide system of liberalized trade and capital markets by pursuing outward-looking reform policies and domestic environments friendly to foreign export and investment. We must also be able to link into the new and growing networks for finance, information, and communication. But globalization does not mean simply taking advantage of economic or technological advances. It also means allowing the Middle East once again to play the enlightening role that it played several times before in history. Globalization at its best does not promote cultural uniformity, but provides opportunities for cultures to interact, enrich and learn from one another, and to live alongside each other in tolerance, respect, and peace. Fourth challenge is the reduction of social and economic disparities within individual countries through social packages that address the distributional aspects of development. Most people in the Middle East, perhaps as much as 3/4 of the population, have a per capita income of only around $1,000 per year. The polarization of societies into a rich minority and a poor majority looms today as another cause of instability and conflict. Peace and regional integration would promote economic restructuring, joint ventures, new export markets, higher productivity, and increased job opportunities, all of which can reduce disparity and increase prosperity further down the road. And our region's fifth critical challenge is domestic political reform. Participatory decision-making is the most important component of good governance. It can also be an essential guarantor of peace by giving people a personal investment in this peace. Throughout the Middle East, it is crucial to integrate culturally appropriate democratic values into our political structures, drawing upon both the rich variety of Arab and Islamic participatory decision-making traditions and the Western democratic experience. Now, how can we address these challenges? Like the challenges themselves, the solutions combine international, regional, national, and local components. On the international level, the United States, as the major political and economic power in the world today, has a special responsibility to continue to act not only as a catalyst, but as a partner to complete the Middle East peace process. Its active sponsorship of the peace process has already yielded a significant measure of success. The international community, especially Europe, which has historic responsibilities in the region, must also play a role in maintaining the momentum for peace. We cannot succeed alone. And the danger of the peace process collapsing entirely is real. It goes without saying that this would have serious implications, not just for our region, but for peace and stability throughout the world. On the regional level, the regional parties in the Middle East and North Africa, with the help and support of the world business community, were able to lay the foundations for regional economic cooperation at the Economic Summit in Amman in 1995. To build upon these foundations, comprehensive peace on all tracks, namely Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese, must be achieved. This requires all parties to cooperate in good faith and calls for a renewed commitment by Israel's new leadership to the implementation of all provisions of existing treaties and agreements. A comprehensive peace would facilitate the involvement of the wider circle of Arab countries and lead to a mutually beneficial partnership. The other challenges must be addressed from within our own societies. For example, we in Jordan have embarked on fundamental reforms in the political and economic spheres simultaneously. In 1988, severance of political ties with the West Bank, which had been occupied by Israel since the 1967 war, in effect placing half of our parliamentary seats under foreign control, allowed us the following year to hold the first parliamentary general elections in 2 decades. To resume our democratic political life and reactivate the provisions of our Constitution. Originally drafted in 1928 and revised in 1952, our Constitution is one of the region's oldest and guarantees political pluralism, popular participation, and accountability. In the same year that we resumed parliamentary elections, we signed the first of 2 structural readjustment programs with the IMF to reduce budget and balance of payment deficits and to alleviate debt burden and consequently encourage sustainable economic growth. A major feature of the Jordanian economy in the coming years will be a more enhanced role of the private sector through the privatization of state and parastatal institutions. The legal, administrative, and fiscal measures already set in place in Jordan have earned us the recognition of the European Union as the most advanced country in the region in implementing market reforms. Our economic liberalization has already had tremendous positive impact on all our macroeconomic indicators. Obviously, political and economic reforms are crucial in themselves, but it is their integration that will yield the greatest results. In 1985, after almost a decade of work in Jordan, I established an umbrella foundation, which Dean and I referred to earlier, for my diverse efforts in the fields of education, culture, children's health and welfare, women, and socioeconomic community development, to promote equal opportunity, increase productivity, and self-reliance through participatory decision-making at the grassroots level. We have designed and successfully implemented projects that have advanced development thinking in Jordan beyond conventional, centralized social welfare practices by integrating social development strategies more closely with national economic priorities, especially through the empowerment of women. As women become active participants and decision makers in the social and economic affairs of their communities, they also become genuine economic forces, improving their status and influence, as well as the overall quality of life and stability of their community. Our programs seek to reinforce and protect their essential role as the anchor of the family, one that has enabled our society to remain relatively cohesive and stable. We have demonstrated that a most effective way to achieve sustainable development, especially in developing societies with limited resources, is by empowering communities to assume ownership and management of their development process and to promote a more equitable distribution of resources and development benefits. Strengthened by increased self-reliance and confidence in themselves, local communities are enjoying a measurable improvement in quality of life, productivity, and stability. They will be more effective and successful in establishing partnerships on a regional basis in the future, and more able to participate in the peace-building process in the era of peace. As Dean Nye mentioned, these projects are considered national and regional development models by United Nations and other international agencies. But more important, we are cooperating to support their implementation in other Arab countries through training and outreach programs. I believe this is a particularly significant facet of our work that can help create the kind of regional environment that will foster peace and accelerate the transition from wasteful militarism to productive socioeconomic cooperation. The quality of peace, combined with the prospects for progress, regionalization, and globalization in the Middle East, will determine if all in our region advance or retreat, prosper or flounder. Events now unfolding may determine the fate of our peoples for many decades to come. We have been summoned by history to make this extraordinary journey of peace and reconciliation. If we fail, if peace remains incomplete, we will all pay a heavy price. But if we succeed, if we achieve a just and comprehensive peace that is accepted by all the peoples of the Middle East, we can build upon our progress and promote cooperation with the rest of the world that fuels economic growth and cultural respect at the same time. The challenges we face are enormous, perhaps even unprecedented in modern history, but the rewards are equally great. We can see the outline of a possible historic reconciliation among the entire Semitic family of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We have no choice but to complete the peace between Arabs and Israelis, a peace that must be built upon already existing foundations, that must be comprehensive and just to be lasting and fruitful. Thank you very much.
Queen Noor has agreed to answer a few questions. There are microphones at either side on the floor and on either side of the balcony. I'd like the first question in each microphone to be from a Harvard student, so she can get some impression of what students are thinking. Or a Princeton student. We'll make it. So why don't we start here?
Queen Noor, I would like to thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's certainly an honor to have you. My question, I have actually two very brief questions for you. The first one is, Many people have forgotten the role that the stance that Jordan took in supporting Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War. And I'm wondering if you can explain that. The other thing I'm wondering is many Palestinians that I've spoken to seem to believe that the royal family could have played a much larger role in accepting them. And I wonder if you would agree that the royal family has to some extent excluded them, whereas they could have brought them into Jordan and made them part of the family. Thank you.
Well, those are not two little questions. Well, the first one certainly is not a little question. I guess that I'll try to be very brief in my answer because it could go on forever, and I've addressed this issue so much over the years. But to be very simple and brief about it, about the main issue, there was, and obviously continues to be, fundamental misunderstanding about Jordan's position during the Gulf War. Jordan never supported the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and in fact immediately called for withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait after its invasion. Our foreign policy has been based, well, certainly since 1967, very clearly on United Nations Security Council resolutions that state very clearly the lack of right, of, the illegality of the occupation of territories conquered by war. And we were consistent in the principles that we emphasized during the Gulf War as well. What we did try very hard to achieve was a diplomatic resolution to the crisis from within the Arab world. We hoped for a variety of reasons that a precedent could be set building on previous intra-regional resolutions of conflict, that that could be reconfirmed and reinforced by an Arab resolution of the invasion of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We felt very strongly that there was time that was needed in the early days. It turned out just to be hours, actually, before foreign troops were called into the region, and that is what we objected to before we had achieved a diplomatic resolution. It suddenly became an expanded military confrontation, which we felt made the situation much more difficult, especially for the people of Iraq, who we felt were those who would suffer the most, who would be the most innocent victims of a conflict that still is causing them terrible agony and distress, and an inability really to play an active, dynamic, and participatory role to this day in their country and its political system. We could talk for much longer about it, but I did want to correct the impression that we supported Iraq in the Gulf crisis. And I hope that answers it reasonably well for you. The second question is an interesting one, because in fact, a number of Palestinians have married into the royal family. So I just say that. I'm not trying to be facetious, but the question, I've never heard that issue raised, that the royal family in any way has created problems or set up barriers. In fact, the king and other members of the royal family, I think, have consistently, over time, tried to ensure we are the only country in the region that has, in fact, provided identity and citizenship, if you will, to Palestinians, Palestinian refugees of the various conflicts that I mentioned in my address. We are the country that hosts the largest number of refugees and has probably spent a far greater percentage of its resources and political energy, not only material resources, on trying to address the basic life needs of these people and their families, and at the same time that it has dedicated itself, the king and other members, of the family in their efforts to, on the international level, to resolve the political tragedy of the Palestinian people. So I'm not sure where that's come from, but I just wanted you to know that even within the most intimate confines of the family, we have welcomed young people whose backgrounds are Palestinian, and we're very proud of them, and we don't differentiate between any members of the family, nor when we've tried very hard to ensure that that is the case in the larger Jordanian family as well.
Yes.
Good evening, Queen Noor. There seems to be an inconsistency in what you said earlier with respect to the various accords that were signed. You mentioned the various countries, and you mentioned the Jordan-Israeli Accord, and you said with a hint of sadness that credit had been lost, trust had been lost when the terms of those accords broke down. And yet you've ended your speech by saying that it will be a historic moment when peace is finalized, and that peace has to be lasting and built on strong foundations. What steps do you think are necessary for such a peace to be achieved? And do you see any factors prevalent today that lead you to believe that such steps will be taken?
Yes, I speak with great sadness about the situation that we are all facing now. I didn't mean to suggest that the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty had in any way broken down. There are various provisions that are not being implemented or are being perhaps questioned that we had expected would move ahead more smoothly. That is causing some measure of frustration, but I wouldn't even mention it if it weren't for the other problems concerning the Israeli-Palestinian relationship that have have highlighted, if you will, and indicated that there may be a tendency, as I mentioned, for those agreements now to be considered open to revision or review, or those are official agreements that have given us all so much hope and confidence, and continue to underlie my optimism in my remarks about what I believe we can build together and we must build together. In terms of factors or the current situation, are there any indications that my optimism or seeing beyond the current state of affairs is in any way justified? I would say that the summit meeting that was recently held in Washington, while given many interpretations or by many in our region as well as here, did in fact succeed in bringing the parties together, the key parties together, to express themselves in a very open and very frank dialogue, and it was the catalyst for resumption of talks that are to continue until there is a resolution of the key issues. So I would say that is what I have to pin my hopes on at the moment, what we all will seek to facilitate support in any way that we can in the coming period.
Thank you.
Left side of the balcony.
Thanks for speaking tonight. I have two very brief questions. One is, today remarks were published by the King to the effect that if the Israeli government continues with its current policies, that Mr. Netanyahu may find himself wearing a gas mask again. So the question really is, has the King, on a personal level, lost faith with the current Israeli Prime Minister? And a second question, kind of unrelated, there were severe riots in Jordan this past summer over food subsidies and issues relating to the economy. And I'm curious if the Jordanian government has reassessed the latest IMF agreement in light of these riots.
Thank you. His Majesty was said in a somewhat colorful way in an interview the other day that he hoped that the situation would not, in the region, would not continue to deteriorate to the point of intense, well, to the point of intensity that the Gulf crisis, that image of Prime Minister, well, at the time, of Benjamin Netanyahu with the gas mask on, being interviewed on CNN, that was sort of symbolic, I suppose, in his interview of a state of tension that we hope never to reach again. In terms of whether he has lost faith or not, well, number one, he doesn't lose faith easily. But that isn't to take away from the fact that he feels that and I don't think I should speak for him, my impression is that that we all feel that a great deal of progress has been achieved, as I made reference to in my remarks. We are in a particularly difficult period now, one in which we are hoping that the combination of actions, many very provocative actions that occurred even leading up to and including the tunnel excavation, that trend will be reviewed, will be halted, will be reconsidered in light of the fact that it's very clear no one has anything to gain from this approach. Neither Israel nor the Arab countries can benefit from increased confrontation, and more importantly, the erosion of the faith and confidence that has slowly been building for so many in the region. There are so many people in the Arab countries and in Israel who support peace. The majority, we believe, in all our countries support peace. And we won't lose faith, if only because we have to keep faith with them and ensure that we do succeed and we don't allow the enemies of peace, which on all sides are poised to take advantage, to benefit from the kind of situation we're in today. Second question. The government in Jordan went through months and months and months of intense scrutiny and research and consideration of the options that it had given our economic restructuring and economic realities vis-a-vis the lifting of subsidies on bread prices and a few other commodities prior to undertaking that, and decided that that by lifting the bread subsidies, but at the same time ensuring that all members of our society living under the poverty line, and in fact, in the end, that were given outright the means to ensure that there was no impact on them of the lifting of bread subsidies. On top of that, the package that was instituted, which was this part was not emphasized very much in the media reports because the riots were so much more exciting, but the package ensured that Jordanians would be compensated in their annual income, if you will, to the amount that they would be equivalent to the lifting of the bread subsidies, but that those who had been profiting by the very low bread prices, lower than anywhere else in our region, and therefore were using them for exporting them for use as feed to livestock in other neighboring countries, and generally in a number of ways taking advantage of the situation, would no longer benefit. That revenue alone would be enough to compensate for the extra measures that would be taken to provide a safety net for the people of Jordan. Very complicated, no doubt unorthodox approach, but one that was trying to take into account the real needs of people, the emotional the fact that in so many countries around the world, when the IMF has insisted on restructuring programs, this issue, especially of bread, has become such an emotional issue and one that needs special attention. On the other hand, if we are to continue with our economic reforms, it was a necessary step to take. We have to work, and we are working very hard to stimulate our economy to provide more job opportunities. And unemployment has come down. Our economy has been growing steadily over the last several years. 6% unemployment has come down from 25% to 15% just in the last few years. So we are making the steps that necessary, but in the meantime, we're all of us having to have a great deal of faith in each other as we get through this period of time.
Next on the right side of the balcony, but from now on, since a lot of people are waiting, one question per customer.
Well, what you really mean is I have to answer them more succinctly. I will try to do that.
But one at a time.
Good evening,
Thank
Queen
you.
Noor. As a Princeton graduate, class of '93, and a current Harvard student, I feel especially privileged to welcome you, and it's an honor to hear you speak. My question has to do with your remarks about goals of integration and using human and capital resources for integration of Arabs and Israelis. And I was wondering if you were specifically talking about economic trade-related interaction, or do you envision social, educational, cultural interaction as well? And is this a short-term goal? Do you think it's viable in the current arena, or do you view it as a long-term goal?
Well, I referred earlier to progress made in the region in my remarks and since. And that is what we are pinning a great deal of hope on, and that we see as a foundation for moving forward. Hopefully also a credible enough foundation to convince all parties that moving forward with the peace process is in all our interests. That progress is more significant on the human level in terms of the interaction you're talking about than even the signing of documents in any capital of the world, because it is peace will only be made, and these agreements will only be given life through the interaction of individuals and institutions on the ground. In where Jordan is concerned, we have made progress already in some tourism and transport agreements. We have a number of other agreements which, as I said, some are being called into question that we had expected to move ahead more rapidly. That doesn't mean that we have given up or assume that they won't be concluded. And some of those are purely bilateral and are trade-oriented, basic infrastructure, in some cases plans to share infrastructure in different, along our borders in different areas. And some are also bilateral but also regional in context, such as environment and water resources and that larger regional integration that is going to be necessary for all of our economies to prosper. So I feel that in many ways we saw after the signing of the treaties an intensification, well, really the beginning of, and then since, fairly intense relations developing, especially among the private sectors in both countries. That, I think, has been the case with other Arab countries as well. And those relationships will play a very important part in reinforcing and complementing the official government-to-government relationships, which right now, I think, are under a great deal of pressure in the region. And it's that pressure I've tried to emphasize. We must break through so that in these other ways we can develop the kinds of economic and other partnerships that will give everyone an investment in the peace process and in a future that is more secure for everyone in the region.
Thank you.
Hello, Sahla, Your Majesty. On the behalf of the Arab Student Society, Harvard Radcliffe, I would like to welcome you. My name is Muhammad El Assas. I'm a freshman at Harvard, and I'm from Jordan. Your Majesty, first of all, allow me to thank you for all the projects that you've taken, which went beyond the frontiers of Jordan. I mean, myself, I'm a graduate of Lester B. Pearson United World College, and I understand, as you are, Your Majesty, you are the chairman, along with President Nelson Mandela, of that institution that wants to promote ideals like international understanding. However, last week, lots of debate has been going around at Harvard about the issues that have been going around in the Middle East. Unfortunately, we witnessed many misconceptions, stereotypes are still going. People thought that, many people, the media in the West, as you've said, the stereotypes are still going. They are still asking the Arabs to make the sacrifices while Israel is presented as they are doing their own share. Your Majesty, what are the steps that Jordan as an Arab country is going to take to ensure that these misconceptions and stereotypes won't go on anymore, or the efforts that you are going to take? As well as I was really glad today to hear that your point about the conception of peace as an irreversible step, and as that Israel is now not worried anymore about doing its agreements. Your Majesty, how do you see that Jordan will react in the future to these feelings that are growing? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I hope I'm not taking the easy way out, but I mean it by saying that I think that what we as not just Jordanians, but Arabs and Americans and Arab Americans who care about the relations between the peoples of our cultures and countries, what we can do about that and what we must do about that is ensure that there are more young people like yourselves who are studying here, and young Americans who come regularly to Jordan to study as well on a regular basis, sponsored by different institutions here, that we have to promote the awareness and understanding of both our own people, young people in particular, who can reach out and act as ambassadors and communicators of their society and their goals and concerns as they affect their own countries and our region, as well as our relationships with other countries. So I would say that one of the things that I certainly feel is particularly important is education and opportunities provided to young people to begin to think and see outside of themselves, to see their country, their own communities in a larger context, and to become links and bridges of understanding between us, one as I have tried to be in my throughout my life. And I think starting here at Harvard, you're going to start off with a very solid foundation, and you're going to be able to achieve and contribute a great deal. What are we going to do in terms of the situation of the moment? I think I've answered that in saying that we are going to try to continue to build on what has been achieved to date. We are going to be very, as I said, the summit meeting was a very frank, open discussion about the positions of the different parties that met there, and we're going to have to continue with that dialogue. We're going to have to hope the dialogue underway now in the region continues, and that we all are able to support it as constructively, uncynically, if you will, as possible, to ensure that we continue to build on the progress and don't allow it to be further eroded. We have to build confidence and trust, and we have to reach out, I think, and as I said, join together the forces for peace as strongly, dynamically, effectively as possible. Those in the region, those here in the United States, and in the rest of the world. Now is the time for us all to be working together to ensure that the message is heard, and that that we will and ensure that the process moves forward and we don't allow extremism and those who the enemies of peace, I hate the expression, but it's a fact, they exist, to win in the end. Sir.
Noor, salam alaikum.
Salam.
What I was wondering is, this isn't a question, so this will give you a little break. It was just that I think King Hussein has been far too underestimated in the past years for the amount of work he does for peace, and the Jordanian people, as well as the people of the Mideast, should be very fortunate to have him, as well as yourself, as rulers. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
We
Thank
really
you.
should stop on that note.
Nice note, yes.
But there's time for one more question.
Okay, good evening, Queen Noor.
Good evening.
My question, you spoke a bit about getting, since the elections tonight, the reinstitution of legislative elections in 1989, and you spoke a bit about involving women more in society and granting them a bit more equality. I'm wondering how much has recently, in the past 5 to 10 years, how much more is public opinion being taken into account in political affairs? Specifically, I'm interested in how public opinion how is the public reaction to the peace treaty signed with Israel in 1993, and how has it changed since then, especially in light of recent difficulties between Israel and the Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, in terms of participatory or popular participation in government and in the decision-making process in the country, it is alive and well in Jordan. The parliament is a free and active and boisterous and often thoroughly frustrating institution, just as it is anywhere else in the world, in any healthy democracy. Women, you mentioned women. There are women in the parliament, and increasing numbers of women who have been running for elections at all levels in the society. Women have been serving in government at the highest levels for a while, quite a while, and are increasingly represented in the in other areas. That we have had our first woman judge appointed recently, and in municipal councils, et cetera, the numbers of women are increasing rapidly. So it is a steady process. I think you're right to link participation in the political process with the subject of women, because I guess I did to some extent, but it is absolutely essential that that half of our population are represented, and that is increasingly recognized and supported and reinforced. In terms of the popular response to the treaty, it was quite interesting. The Madrid Peace Conference, when it was convened after, in the still very emotional and turbulent aftermath of the Gulf War. And it was very interesting for us to see how positively people responded in the country to that conference and the hope, if you will, or the possibilities that it might give way to in terms of resolution of conflict in the region. These are people who have seen so many initiatives and who have been through so much in our region on all sides, and yet, and in Jordan, we're also undergoing severe economic problems as a result of the Gulf crisis and our economic restructuring. Nonetheless, there was a very positive response. To the peace treaty, again, The peace treaty was responded to as a logical, I think, and desirable development. The main concern for the people of Jordan, and I think most of the other Arab countries, is that our treaty and what was achieved with the Palestinians in the Oslo agreements and the Egyptian-Israeli treaty are quickly followed by a comprehensive resolution of the outstanding problems with Palestinians, Syrians, and the Lebanese. Until that is the case, none of these the progress or the developments that have taken place will never be seen by the people of the region as having a future. That depends on the comprehensive resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That means, as I said, that all the outstanding problems must be resolved with all the concerned parties. Then there will be, I think, we've already seen, as I said, in the positive response of our own people to our incremental steps, there will be a very, very different picture than the one that we have today, in which there's a great deal of suspicion and distrust and confirmation of extremist claims from the start that there would be, that this process would lead nowhere, and that we did not have sincere partners in the peace process. We don't want to believe that, and we will work very hard to reinforce what has been achieved, to hope that on a people-to-people basis we can continue to develop the kinds of relationships that will be reflected in more sensitive and constructive policies on the part of the different governments involved.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, Queen Noor is on a tight schedule, but we are very grateful for you for being with us tonight, and we hope that you will be back with us again short of 10 years, and that all will go well in the interim. Thank you very much.
You got a terrific turnout.
Well, considering the weather.
You have to realize that there are balconies
know.
up there that you can't see. This is a full house.
Well, it's a great privilege to be here.